So Joel, I have a range of questions to ask you. Thank you for being willing to do this interview, even though it was your idea. And
Well, I just felt bad that I wasn't able to come to the conference in person, but for you to come to Washington, me happen to be in the States at this moment, and this is a good location.
What's the background back there,
Yeah,
Joel?
you could do worse. I think we're at the Kremlin. Oh, no, I'm sorry. We're at the White House, just across the street.
How beautiful.
And it is, in many ways, this book, Enemies and Allies, is about who are America's enemies 20 years after 9/11 and who are our allies, and
right.
What does that look like? And one of the moments in the book, I literally take you inside with me into the Oval Office and sit with the President of the United States across the Resolute desk, the Vice President sitting here, Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, to talk about this very topic. Who are our enemies? Who are our allies?
Absolutely awesome, Joel. And I know that we're all looking forward to reading it. I'm starting it tonight. You have a different journey that I'd like to talk to you about. In your books and in your blogs, you show just the deepest interest in the nation of Israel. What did God do in your life to give you this burden and this heart for Israel? I understand the Jewish part, but how did God move in your life to give you this burden and love for Israel?
Well, the first thing, it's kind of funny to say this to you, but I didn't know I was Jewish until I was in the 5th grade. And you're like, Joel, seriously, your name is Joel Rosenberg. How did you not know you were Jewish? You must have been the dumbest kid in the class. Nevertheless, I'm sure I was, but nevertheless, I didn't know because my father didn't tell me. My father had had such a bad experience with his own parents. He was mean to them. They were mean to him. It was not a home of love. It was an Orthodox Jewish home, and many Orthodox Jewish homes are very loving and warm, but his wasn't. He didn't have any warmth or deep connection to his synagogue or to his Jewish community in Brooklyn. He left Brooklyn and decided to go to the Promised Land, which for him was Southern California. He married a Gentile, which his Jewish mother flipped out, offered to buy the engagement ring back from him at a profit to him. Don't marry the non-Jewish girl.
I didn't know that one.
And that they were married in 65. They had me in 67. My mom came to faith in Jesus first in 1973. 6 months later, after really carefully studying the gospel according to Luke, my father came to faith in Jesus. And of course, he thought he was the first Jew since the Apostle Paul who believed this. But because he didn't have warm, nostalgic memories of his Jewish upbringing, he didn't want to talk about it. So he didn't tell me. Now, what happened? When I was in 5th grade, my father was asked by some elders in the little Bible church that we were attending, now that we were believers, hey, Len, you're Jewish, right? He's like, why do you ask? He said, because we have a 6th grade Sunday school class that needs a teacher, and it's all Old Testament stories. And we thought you'd be great for it. So we thought, well, I probably know the Old Testament better than the kids. Sure. So my dad starts teaching 6th grade Sunday school. Now, what happens? There's a little girl in the class who started asking him all the time, hey, Mr. Rosenberg, that's Jewish, right? You're a Jew. You're from a Jewish background. Well, yeah, I guess so. Did you celebrate, Rosh Hashanah? Did you celebrate Yom Kippur? She knew a lot about this in 6th grade. When it came up to Passover, she said, Mr. Rosenberg, did you celebrate Passover? Well, of course. Well, what did you do and how did it work? And could we celebrate Passover together? Would you have a Seder for us? He's like, I guess so. So he comes home from church that Sunday and he tells me and my sister and my mom, hey, listen, I'm going to have a Passover Seder next week in my class. I'd love it if you guys attended. So I'm like, a what? A Passover Seder, he says. I said, what's Passover? I said, what do you mean, what's Passover? You don't know what Passover is? I said, no, that's why I'm asking. So he tells me the story briefly. I said, what's a Seder? He's like, well, you don't know what a Seder is? I said, no, I don't know. So he tells me what a Seder is. I said, how would you know how to do that? He says, because I'm Jewish. I was like, wait, what? You're Jewish? Does that mean I'm Jewish? How did that never come up? Seriously, 5th grade, he's teaching 6th grade, I learned. And that's how I discovered I was Jewish. But over time, became fascinated, and particularly fascinated with being Jewish and being a believer in Jesus in a world that there wasn't that many of us,
Right.
and thinking, to whom much has been given, much is required. What's my responsibility as a Joel Rosenberg who believes in Jesus?
And then how did God direct your heart to love Israel? There are a lot of people that are listening to you right now who have perhaps a good biblical understanding of Israel, but maybe they love Israel, maybe they're curious about Israel, but how did God grab hold of your heart and give you a love for the land of Israel and the people of Israel?
It's a great question, Mitch, and it's great in part because my parents weren't promoting it. They didn't have any they didn't have any hostility towards Israel, but we weren't a family that was like, "Ooh, let's all go to Israel." My dad wasn't talking about this much. A little bit more post the Seder than before, but it just wasn't a thing. We were going to a church that loved Jesus, but wasn't promoting Israel, wasn't thinking, "Oh, that's an incredibly important, biblically prophetic, significant development." So I wasn't getting any Christian Zionism. I wasn't getting any Messianic Judaism. I just was growing in my faith bit by bit. But the Lord just started stirring me. I can only say that God has plans for us, right? Plans for good, not for evil, plans to give us hope in a future. And his intention, apparently, was for me to understand this and embrace this Jewish identity. To not worry so much that my mother's not Jewish. Okay, I love my mother, so that means I love Gentiles who love Jesus. I love Jews who love Jesus. I love Gentiles and Jews who don't yet love Jesus. I didn't have an identity crisis. I just found this more and more fascinating. And when I was at Syracuse University as an undergraduate studying filmmaking, there was an opportunity to go with the head of the film program to Tel Aviv University for 6 months for part of my junior year. And he asked me if I'd like to go. I said, absolutely. And this, just arriving in Israel and traversing the country and seeing the Bible come alive, it was like I was seeing in Technicolor. I just had this deep sense, this is the center of the universe. This is the center of God's plan and purpose. I don't know in what way I'm going to be involved in Israel over time, but Lord, you're doing something in me. I just love this country. Show me what you want from me.
That was a long path from being a fifth grader who didn't know he was Jewish.
Yeah, and again, I emphasize the point that I wasn't getting all this input about Bible prophecy, about Christian Zionism, about Messianic Judaism, about none of it. So classically, somebody who's growing up in that might think, yeah, this is exciting. I should know more about this. Let's go. The Lord was just doing something in me which wasn't even consistent. I love the people in that little church, but it wasn't the strongest Bible church on the planet. So we weren't like going deep into the scriptures. But the Lord,
the Lord did it.
The Lord stirred something in me. And
did you sense?
But I really lit up. Once I actually got there, I was like, this is it. So where do we go?
An experience with the land and the people can really transform your life.
Especially as a young person,
So we encourage that.
It didn't need necessarily, right? The Lord can do it in any way. In my case, I apparently didn't need parents or congregation or a political movement or a religious movement that was promoting it. He just needed to bring me there and show me and have me go, wow, this is big.
So when did you sense God's call to bring your family to Israel?
Well, it's a couple stages. The short version is we never intended to become citizens. I didn't even think that was legal because I was fairly outspoken about my love for Jesus and my belief that everybody in the world, including Jewish people, especially Jewish people, need to at least hear that Jesus is the Messiah, to hear the case. Hopefully everybody who listens will believe it, but they need to at least hear it. How are they going to believe if they haven't heard it, right? We're right out of Romans. And I'm outspoken on that, and I'm Googleable on the topic. So I really didn't think anyone would give me citizenship in Israel. I didn't even think about it. It wasn't like, oh, that's too bad. I just thought, I don't need to be a citizen. I don't need to live there. We travel in and out. We started a ministry called the Joshua Fund to raise funds from evangelicals and to invest in humanitarian relief in Israel, to strengthen the body of believers in Israel, in the Palestinian territory, and in several of the neighboring Arab countries as well. So that gave me an opportunity to come in and out, to be teaching all over the United States and Canada and Europe about God's heart for Israel. And I got fascinated in Bible prophecy. I was teaching about Bible prophecy. Israel has a unique traffic light system, different from the United States.
It goes from right to left?
Well, yeah, no, but it goes from red to flashing yellow to green. Okay. It's almost like you're at a drag race. Everybody starts gunning their engines and rolling forward, and if you are not moving on green, everyone behind you is going to lay on their horn. So I was going out to do some errands, and I was at the traffic light, and suddenly the light went from red to flashing yellow. And while I haven't had this experience much in my life, I really believe that the Holy Spirit was saying, this is you. Get ready to move here and become a citizen.
Wow.
That so threw me that I didn't even see it turn green. I just was like, what? That's crazy. What am I? And everybody's honking at me. And for the next 3 days, I didn't even mention this to Lynn, my wife, because I thought maybe I had a bad falafel. I don't know, maybe a bad, batch of hummus. There's no way that at my age and the kids at their ages, God is going to move us to make Aliyah. I just didn't see it. I finally said to Lynn, I think the Lord is saying this. And she said, well, okay, I'm on red. I said, that's fine. It's like a nuclear submarine. Unless God turns our keys together, we're not going to go. And I'm not going to push it. If this is the Lord, things will start to happen. And we'll just be faithful, and if we need to gather, documents or whatever. And honestly, I never believed it was really going to happen. Not never. But I wasn't entirely sure that God was going to have us become citizens. Maybe just the process. Maybe we were going to get stuck. Maybe we were going to go to the Supreme Court. I don't know. But as it happens, 2 months after we handed in our last piece of paperwork, boom, we had our citizenship. There wasn't a fight. There wasn't a legal battle. And honestly, the challenge is once the door opened, once we moved, it was very, very hard. I think it's hard for any Jew coming to Israel, but if you come from a country where you're experiencing anti-Semitism, you're coming from Ukraine, you're coming from Yemen, I don't know, from Persia, I don't know, you're like, look, it's bad, it's difficult here in Israel, but thank God I'm not in Ukraine or in wherever. Americans can't say that.
Different story.
And if every Jew who left Egypt during the Exodus wanted to go back to slavery, you could imagine some of the members of my family thinking, hey, it's not slavery, let's go back to America, like where, Northern Virginia, where life was easy, leeks and onions and
the leeks and onions of Northern Virginia.
The Red Lobsters and the
not the Red
famous
Lobsters.
Dave's. No, I just
not kosher. So Joel, it's not just that you have a love for Israel and for the Jewish people, but also you've in a very unique and inspirational way to a lot of us, you've developed a great love and interest in others in the Middle East, both within Israel and the Middle East. And I know that through the Joshua Fund, you've had a lot of activities where you've tried to do authentic reconciliation, where you've tried to bring people together. You've been a peacemaker, Joel, and I wish you a hearty mazel tov. Congratulations on doing that. That's been a very, very meaningful and valuable ministry. So what did God do in your life to give you such a great love for Israel's neighbors?
Several things. I think, first of all, it's a theological conviction. Jesus, as the Jewish Messiah, did command, love your neighbors. Okay, well, they're not neighbors. They're enemies, Lord. They're enemies. Syria, the Hezbollah, Hamas, all, whatever. Okay, well, love your neighbors, or love your enemies. Well, that pretty much covers everybody then. If you're either a neighbor or an enemy. So the question is, how do you do that? So theologically, Lynn and I believe that. But the Lord did several things. One, we very early in our marriage, long before we met Israelis or even long before I met you, or anybody in the Jewish ministry world. I mean, literally, we kept meeting Arab Christians and Arab Christian leaders from Lebanon, from Iran. Well, they were Persians, from other parts of the region, and from Egypt. Palestinian evangelical leaders, and God just created this friendship with us and them. We were young, we were wet behind the ears, we were excited to learn, and for some reason it was almost like God had blocked the doorways into meeting people like yourself or anybody in the Chosen People ministry world or Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem world. The doors he kept opening was to Arab Christian leaders and people who were overseeing, major ministries. And as we became friends with these folks, we really got excited. Wow, look what God's doing on the Arab side and the Persian side and the Muslim side generally. I would have said for most of my life that Islam was the last frontier of the gospel. Until I met these guys who were saying, no, Muslims are coming to faith in record numbers. It's still a huge universe of 1.8 billion people, so in the grand scheme, but we're seeing Muslims come to faith in by the millions.
Exciting.
It is exciting. So I discovered over time, wow, God really does love the neighbors. He loves the enemies. He's drawing them to himself. And it turns out Israel and the Jewish people are the last frontier of the gospel. We are the alpha and omega of missions. And I think it's interesting, right, that on the one hand, he came to his own and his own received him not. And yet, Romans 11:26 tells us that in the end, for a certain cohort at the end of the end, all Israel will get saved. So that's encouraging.
So we are the end of the road. When the Jewish people turn to Jesus, then Jesus returns. A lot of people feel that they need to take one side or the other. So can you love Israel, believe that God brought the Jewish people back to the land? The land actually does belong to the Jewish people, and yet also love Palestinians. So how do you work that out? Do we need to choose sides, or can we say yes and yes?
Yeah. Well, the way we say it, my family and our ministry, the Joshua Fund, is that God is not an either or God. He doesn't love one side to the exclusion of the other. He is a both and God. Meaning, if you look at a verse just simple like John 3:16, probably the most famous verse in the Bible, in the New Testament for certain, for God so loved the world, meaning everybody in it. And we do see Jesus crosses into Lebanon, and he does ministry in Tyre, a city which still exists today in Lebanon. The news about him spreads all through Syria. We read in the early chapters of Matthew. We see him cross the Jordan River, across the Sea of Galilee, and minister to people in what we would now call the territory of the Kingdom of Jordan. He dramatically heals 2 demon-possessed men. One of them says, "Let me follow you back into Israel." And he says, "No, take this message of what you've seen and heard and go all through your country and tell your people about it." So God doesn't love just one side or the other. Now, he has a special and unique plan for the nation of Israel and the people of Israel. That comes with a lot of benefits. It also comes with a lot of responsibilities and risks. If we don't follow him, we have suffered throughout history, been driven into exile and so forth. But it's very important. It's very important theologically and practically to realize God loves the Palestinian people. He loves the Syrians, and he loves the Lebanese and the Jordanians and the Iraqis and the Egyptians, and he loves everybody. And we who love Israel and who love the Jewish people, and those of us certainly who are Israelis or Jews, we need to be intentional about saying it, because too much of evangelicalism has split into camps. They are pro-Israel, and therefore they feel like they don't even need to talk about Palestinians, or their language or tone is hostile, because they feel like they have to defend something, and by defending Israel's right to be safe and sovereign, that somehow if you were friendly to a Palestinian, that might be betraying your tribe. That's not true, but it feels true to people. But the same token, you have people who they love the Palestinians and they're very hostile to Israel. They consider Israel an apartheid state or colonialist, imperialist. And the point is, you can love the Palestinian people and want dignity and the protection of their human rights and their religious freedom and so forth without wanting the destruction of the state of Israel or accusing Israel of things. Look, Israel is guilty of a number of things, but apartheid is not one of them, right? 20% of the Israeli society is Arab, mostly Muslim, but also some Christians. And Arabs serve on our Supreme Court. They serve as judges, as police officers, as the heads of our banks. They can form political parties. They can vote. We have members of the Knesset who are Arabs. That is not apartheid, and it's offensive to accuse Israel of things that aren't true. Even though yes, there are many tensions between the Arabs and Jews in Israel. So the church, I think, needs to take the lead at loving Israel and her neighbors, and not thinking that it's a zero-sum game. That's not the way Jesus played it. That's not what he teaches us.
Now, some of these sentiments and biblical commitments have caused a number of us to band together, like you and I, and form a group called the Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem. And so can you just tell us a little bit about the Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem?
Well, I was honored to be one of the founding members of the Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem because what I thought was missing several years ago from the evangelical dialogue was a group of theologians and Christian leaders of various kinds. But what I thought we needed, and agreed with your view when you laid that out for me, was a group of leaders who were willing to say, yes, the Bible says these things about Israel and the Jewish people. We do not have to distance ourselves from biblical truth in these areas regarding Israel and the Jews. But that doesn't mean that we're hostile to Palestinians. And too many, not every, but too many evangelical leaders, unfortunately, have let themselves slip into an either-or language, and where I'm very, very pro this, so I am hostile to this, or I sound dismissive. That is not the full gospel. That is not the Bible. It's not love your enemy, and it's not love your neighbor. So whether you consider a Palestinian a neighbor or an enemy, we're still supposed to love them. So how? Well, first, it's our language, it's our tone, it's our recognition that they exist. People. I hear people who love Israel all the time tell me there are no Palestinians. All right, how are you going to go explain to 4 or 5 million people that they don't exist? It's a non-starter. Number one. Number two, God loves them. Why don't we should, the Palestinian people are among the most badly treated and poorly led people groups on the entire planet. Yes, some of them and their leaders have made bad choices, but haven't we all? The question becomes, do we really want them to live in squalid refugee camps? Do we want them, or do we want them to have peace, and we want them to have prosperity, and we want them to have access to all kinds of freedoms, including religious freedom, including the ability to hear the message of Jesus and say, I'm for that or against it. I want that for them. I want and as an Israeli, I want it. It doesn't mean I'm willing to compromise on Israeli security. One of the things I've tried to do as being part of the Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem is say, first, what's biblically true? And that's what you're referring to is, we went through and we said, these statements, we affirm these theological statements because they're biblically true, and we show the verses where we draw that from. And then these things, no, these are things that have been said about Israel or about the Palestinians or whatever. We deny this. This is not biblical truth. So that's one thing we can do. But the other question is, how do you talk about the topic of Arab-Israeli peace, of Israeli-Palestinian tension, of all these issues, the theology of the land. These are very controversial topics, but how do we talk about them with biblical truth, but speaking the truth in love? How do we talk about these issues in a way that if a Palestinian Christian or Palestinian Muslim was sitting with us, they might not agree with us. They may vehemently disagree with us, but are we pouring gasoline on that fire, or are we saying, look, let's have a conversation about what the Bible teaches? And the Bible teaches that you are worthy and that God loves you and he cares for you and he wants a future for you. How do we navigate this together? And I think it's not just substance, it's tone. That's a big part of what the Alliance for Peace of Jerusalem is talking about. As other pastors and ministry leaders who don't spend this much time on these issues are looking for resources and allies and points of view that say, I think I'm curious how other people talk about this in a way that's balanced and loving.
Right.
That's a big part of what we're trying to do.
And the Alliance for the Peace of Jerusalem website has videos. It's got the statement that you can sign, and I encourage everybody to go to that.
Yes.
Because it's very, very valuable. We're at a conference where we are honoring the heroes and the fallen and the survivors of 9/11. It's a very emotionally volatile situation. And of course, now in light of what's going on in Afghanistan, it just intensifies everything to quite a degree. But we want to take a look at life always through a biblical lens, and we want to see the situation in the Middle East, even today, through a biblical lens. You had quite a first book, Joel. It really propelled you into the national discussion on Arab, Palestinian, and Israel relationships and relationships with the U.S., obviously. Tell us about The Last Jihad and why you wrote what you wrote and how some of this actually came to pass.
People ask each other all the time, where were you on 9/11?
Yeah.
On 9/11, I was in the home where my wife and I were renting with our boys, 15 minutes away from Washington Dulles Airport. I was finishing the final chapters of my first ever novel. I didn't have a contract for it. I just was writing it on speculation, just hoping to, I'd always wanted to do this since I was a young kid. I was taking a shot, but what was interesting about that novel, The Last Jihad, was the first page puts you inside the cockpit of a jet plane that's been hijacked by radical Islamist terrorists, and it's coming in on a kamikaze attack mission into an American city. And the story leads from that opening set of chapters to my fictional American president moving U.S. forces to remove Saddam Hussein from power because of his connection, his previous ownership and use of weapons of mass destruction, and his financial and political and military support for terrorist organizations. That's the narrative arc of The Last Jihad. Kamikaze attack to a war in Iraq. And I was finishing that book.
Joe.
Well, as it turns out, now there was a number of differences in my version to what really happened, but on the morning of September 11th, I did not have TV on. I didn't have radio on. I was jeans and a t-shirt, cup of coffee, finishing the final chapters of that manuscript when my wife burst into the house, said, "Do you know what's happening? Turn on television. Did you hear what's happening?" No. And I raced downstairs and we turned on the television and we saw the second plane go into the second tower in Manhattan. And then, of course, everything that unfolded, the attack on the Pentagon and the downing of the plane over Shanksville, into Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and all the rest. That's how I got started in my career. As it happened, the book came out a year later, 5.5 months as it happened. Before a war in Iraq, the president of the United States, then George W. Bush, was trying to make a decision whether he was going to go to war to remove Saddam Hussein from power. But when my novel released in November of 2002, I mean, nobody had ever heard of me. I'd never written a book before. I wasn't a household name. But I ended up doing 160 radio and TV shows in about a 60-day period. And everybody kept asking, how could you have written a novel that seems so eerily prescient, and you wrote it all before it happened? And of course, the big national debate was, should we or shouldn't we go into Iraq?
Joel, one of the reasons I love what you write is because, number one, I always need a good spy thriller because I used to fly a lot. We'll see what happens in the future. But your views on things are rooted and grounded in your own personal study of Scripture, of the prophets, of today and of tomorrow, of the end times in particular, of the role Israel plays. And so it seems to me that that kind of erupts in how you write and what you write about. And then it's uncanny because if you remember back in September of 2001, there wasn't a lot of focus on the part of evangelicals or Americans on the Middle East, hostile or otherwise. I think it was just so distant, so exotic, such a gulf, something so strange to us that we just weren't even paying attention to it. And through the last jihad, and probably through those interviews, you actually brought the Middle East to some degree to a lot of Christians, and almost in a good way, because we were really hurting. And if there was anything we felt as believers, I was in New York, if there's anything we felt, which we knew we shouldn't, but because we know that Jesus wants us to love everybody, he died for the whole world, but there was such outrage in our hearts, in our souls, because of what this group that we didn't understand did to us. We didn't understand that there were various factions, that there were anti-Western Muslim extremists that were willing to do violence, and then there were average people in anywhere from Afghanistan to Iraq or Iran or Saudi Arabia. We lumped everybody together because we just didn't know. And through your books, sometimes in the most entertaining way, and in your nonfiction books, you've helped evangelicals better understand the Arab world. And because of that, we're not as angry at everybody. And we're able to delineate between the different elements in the Arab world. And that's really helped us witness, share the gospel. And during this conference, we're hearing from all sorts of Arabs and former Muslims who have come to love Jesus and actually love Israel, and which is spectacular. And you've added to that. And so, if I may, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the backstory. How did you do your research for enemies and allies? Any good stories, Joel, about maybe some Arab leaders? What are some of these leaders like? What should we know? How can we pray for them?
Yeah, well, those are good questions, and I appreciate it very much, Mitch. One of the things I've tried to do from the first novel and right up through to the current books, and of course the nonfiction books as well, is provide different perspectives. Like in the novels, there are characters who are Muslims and they're evil. They're hell bent on killing, robbing, destroying, but not every Muslim character is, because that's not true of the vast majority of Muslims. And so it's important to have Muslim characters who are heroes. I did a whole series where an Iranian Shia Muslim, nominal, but still from a Muslim background, a Muslim family, he's the hero of the book. I had a Christian publisher allowing me to make David Shirazi the main character of my books. That's almost never happens in Christian publishing. The point is that a novel, a work of fiction, is operating at a different level in your brain, in your heart, in your mind, in your soul. It's drawing you into a story. It's not trying to teach you point blank a set of facts. It's trying to grab you and draw you into a story and take you on a journey. And by doing that, you treat it differently than a nonfiction book. You're usually not underlining it and thinking, oh, that's an interesting point. Oh, that guy's a moron. I don't believe that. You're hopefully, if the novelist is doing it right, you are along for a roller coaster ride. You strap in and you're out of the gates from the first sentences. And that allows me to help my readers emotionally connect with, identify, or at least observe people they would never see in their normal lives. And even though they may be focused on the hero and the villain, they're meeting other people along the way and they're absorbing information differently. I think that's one of the exciting elements of being a novelist. Now, one of my challenges is, how do I portray moderate Muslims? I don't agree with Islam. I'm an evangelical Christian, so I don't theologically agree with Islam. But if I had to choose between a moderate Muslim and a radical Islamist or an apocalyptic Islamist, I'm going to take the moderate, obviously, right? So I was writing a series a few years ago, Mitch, in which I was worried that Al-Qaeda was in Iraq was morphing into something more dangerous, more nefarious, what became known as the Islamic State or ISIS. Now, at the time, I had two CIA directors, former CIA directors, telling me this is happening and this is a villain you may want to write about, an organization that most Americans don't know about yet. So I wrote a series. And at the time I wrote the first book called The Third Target, no one had heard about ISIS. The President of the United States, President Obama, was telling us that Al-Qaeda in Iraq was a JV squad, just, junior varsity, not really a big deal. And it's the President of the United States with all the resources of the American intelligence community. So I decided to have ISIS capture a cache of chemical weapons in Syria and then start to try to cause genocidal attacks against multiple enemies over the next few books. His first objective is to assassinate King Abdullah, the king of Jordan, blow up his palace and take over his kingdom, the kingdom of Jordan. Now, King Abdullah in real life is a fascinating man. He's a direct descendant of Muhammad. He's a former Special Forces commando. He rose to be the head of all special forces in Jordan. He never thought he was going to be the king. His uncle was the crown prince. His father was the king. But at the last minute, 3 days before King Hussein died of cancer, he named Abdullah his heir. I just found that he's like, he was already an action hero and a moderate. And so I thought, I don't know how to make him up. So I'm going to make him a character. I'm going to make him the king that ISIS is trying to kill. Now, Mitch, this is not the brightest move in the world when you're an Israeli, Jewish, evangelical who lives right across the river to write a series of books about people trying to assassinate your next door neighbor. Like, is that loving your neighbor? Okay. What happened? What happened is the king read it. One of his advisors stumbled upon it in an airport, read it, brought it to the king and said, Your Majesty, you have to read this. And he said, why? He said, because you're in it. What do you mean? It's a novel. What do you mean I'm in it? I know, but you're a character in the book. You're a central character. Well, as it happens, he took a few days and the king read The Third Target. Well, actually, he read the next one. Sorry, he read The First Hostage. He hadn't read, it was the second in the series. He didn't read the first one. But he got so interested in how could this American, Israeli, Jewish, evangelical, who is this person who wrote about me, and this is a New York Times best-selling novel? So rather than banning me from his kingdom forever, he invited my wife and me to come and visit him for 5 days, all expenses paid. And we accepted. And the first day we got there, he sent a car and brought us to the palace. The palace that he governs from. And he said, Joel, it's nice to meet you. I was trying to think where would be fun to meet you for the first time. And I thought, well, you did blow up my palace. This is the palace. I thought you ought to see the actual palace that you fictionally blew up. I said, well, it is lovely, sir. Your Majesty, I didn't mean any harm. I wanted to show people a worst case scenario. And he said, well, if I thought you meant harm, I wouldn't have invited you. Then he said, I see that you made me a character, but my staff, my advisors, these are all fictional names, but I can see who's who. So I bought copies of your book, and I give them to my staff, and I say, here, this is you on page 34. You don't make it through the terrorist attack. You might want to read that. Sense of humor, and over the next 5 days, we got to spend time with a person that very few people get to meet. And at the end of it, he invited us to a private dinner at his private palace with just a few of his personal friends. And at the end of a 2-hour evening, 2.5 hours, I think, I said, Your Majesty, I hope you know that I had a great respect for you when I wrote the series, but spending time with you, that has been deepened. And I'm just curious. I think that other evangelicals would be fascinated to meet you, not someone like you. Very few people get a chance to meet a moderate Muslim monarch who's a descendant of Muhammad. And would you ever have any interest? And he said, Joel, why don't we put together a delegation together, and you bring over a group of leaders that you think would benefit from this. And this set into motion 5 meetings with him, 5 meetings with President El-Sisi in Egypt, 2 meetings with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, 1 meeting with the Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates, meetings with the leaders of Bahrain. And those meetings become the stories that I tell in Enemies and Allies. Front row seat, you're getting to sit with not just with observers, which would be interesting enough, but not just with a foreign minister, not just with an advisor to a monarch or a crown prince. You're sitting for hours in the book with me and our group of evangelical leaders. You're sitting listening to us ask questions, like to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. How come you don't have any churches? In your entire country, you don't allow a single church. Could we talk about that? What do you think about peace with Israel? And so on and so forth. And there is not a single book like this.
And he was willing to talk about it.
He was, on the record. And there are several books about Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. A Wall Street Journal, 2 Wall Street Journal reporters wrote one. A New York Times reporter wrote one. A former CIA expert on Saudi Arabia wrote one. None of them ever met him. Wow. We were invited to meet with him twice, as well as his inner circle. And this is the first book that takes you in and lets you sit and listen. Now, you may love him or you may hate him. You may agree with him or you may disagree with him. But nobody's ever met him. Almost nobody. And certainly there's not a single book out there that takes you into the palace. And we were told by the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, Joel, you all are the first Christian leaders in the 300 years that the Saud family has controlled much of the Arabian Peninsula that has ever been invited into the palace. And that was an amazing thing, not just to be a Christian leader sitting with him, but an Israeli and a Jew and an evangelical. Like that's quite a set of identities.
That could make for a joke, Joel. I have 2 questions. One, do you feel that out of your conversations and out of these leaders meeting evangelical leaders, particularly from the West, from America, do you feel that helped the status of Christians, evangelicals in their various countries at all?
I hope so. I think time will tell. In every country except Saudi Arabia, we made it a point to sit down with local pastors and Christian leaders. In Egypt, for example, we met with dozens of the top evangelical Protestant Egyptian Christian leaders, as well as with the Coptic Orthodox Pope Tawadros, and his senior team. We spent hours with them listening, just asking them questions, but listening. What do you face as Christians? How can we pray for you? How can we convey to other Christians around the world? And those stories, those conversations, at least the parts that were not off the record, some of it was very sensitive. In Jordan, we met with several dozen Jordanian pastors and Christian ministry leaders. They asked that their conversation be off the record. They wanted to give us a sense of what was happening, but it was sensitive for them, and it was different. They're a country of 9 million people. Egypt's a country of 100 million people. So, but whether they're direct quotes or they're observations that we had, that those issues and their needs and their prayer requests are in this book. But have we seen churches get built in Saudi Arabia yet? We haven't. That's something we're still working on.
But I'm sure it's got to be helpful, because they probably never met evangelicals before. They never met real believers, and maybe they didn't spend a lot of time with some of the believers in their own country. That would have put them in an awkward position with the Islamic clerics in their countries, I'm sure.
Yeah, in Saudi Arabia, it's the most sensitive. But we said to the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, we said, and he's the heir to the throne. If he were to become the monarch in the next several years, he's only 36, 37 years old. He could reign for half a century. When we began, I said, I noticed, Your Royal Highness, that earlier this year, and this was 2018, but earlier this year, you flew to Cairo and you sat with Pope Tawadros, the Coptic Orthodox Pope, in St. Mark's Church under a painting of Jesus. I don't remember any Saudi leader in history going into a church, much less having an open conversation with the leader of the largest Christian population in the entire Arab world. He goes, well, that's because it's never happened. We're the first, and this is the new direction of Saudi Arabia, to be open to other religions and to be building friendships. I said, then we noticed that you went to England, went to London, and you met with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, the head of the Anglicans, standing there in a robe, his big metal cross. You're standing there. We don't remember you ever doing, or any Saudi leader doing that. No, this is new. I said, and now we understand we're the first Christian leaders in 300 years to be invited here to the palace. But I'm curious. We are all curious. We're guessing that the term evangelical is not a term used much here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Is that a fair assessment? And he laughed and he said, yeah, that's probably fair. I said, well, we have with us an ordained pastor on the delegation. Could he just take a moment and explain what is an evangelical Christian? What is it that we believe? He said, absolutely, please. So imagine, this is, and that discussion on the record, you'll see it. This is not normal. Now, I don't want to paint the picture that all is well in Saudi Arabia or in the Arab or Muslim world or even in Israel, but there are major changes that are going on. These are sweeping, tectonic changes of attitude, of reforms at government levels and on the street. And most American evangelicals are not so aware of these sweeping, game-changing moments, because we have understandably been so consumed with the health crisis of COVID, the economic crisis induced by COVID, churches being closed, the government, the debate over what control government has over our lives, race riots, there's been so many issues, and of course an incredibly divisive political campaign. A lot of what's happening is being missed, and I think the 20th anniversary of 9/11 is sort of the obvious moment to kind of look back up and say, well, what is going on over there?
Yeah, and that will lead us to praying for the peace of Jerusalem and for God's peace to spread throughout the region. So Joel, you had a very fascinating experience in meeting the president of Egypt, didn't you?
I did, and it became the first of a number of meetings. But it was here in Washington. In April of 2017, President Trump had just taken office a few months before, and he invited the new Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. One of the meetings he had was with 60 Middle East experts, and I got invited. People can debate that, but anyway, I got invited. Well, when the whole meeting was over and we'd gone through all our questions with President of Egypt, he stood up, his entourage stood up, we all stood up. We just assumed he was going to leave, but he didn't. He just started chatting with the people at the head table. So nobody was going up to talk to Sisi. So I thought, well, listen, I want to meet the president of Egypt. Unless the Secret Service tackles me, I'm going to go up there. So I go up there. Nobody stops me. Next thing I know, I'm reaching out my hand and I'm introducing myself to President El-Sisi. I say I'm a U.S.-Israeli dual citizen. I'm Jewish. I'm an evangelical. And I just want to thank you, Mr. President, for rescuing 100 million Egyptians from the reign of terror of the Muslim Brotherhood. I said, well, you're welcome. I said, I want to thank you because I see that you're meeting with Jewish leaders and Catholic leaders. You've got Pope Francis coming and other religious leaders. I don't remember any Egyptian leader doing this. He goes, well, this is the new Egypt. We're leading in a new direction. I said, well, it's encouraging. He said, well, thank you. I said, now I haven't noticed that you've met with any evangelicals, but maybe that was off the record. Maybe it just didn't get reported. He said, no, I don't think I have. I said, well, I'd encourage you to do that. There are about 60 million evangelical Christians in the United States, 600 million worldwide. We're a very influential group. And I was just with King Abdullah recently, and he's inviting a delegation of us over to meet with him. And so it's something to think about. And he said, would you like to bring a delegation? Now, he has no idea who I am. But I was like, I need to pray about that. Yes. No, I was like, wow, well, I'd be honored. And so we chatted about it for a moment. Then he turns to the three men next to him, his foreign minister, his chief of staff, and the ambassador. He said, gentlemen, make it happen. A couple days later, I fly home to Israel. We have Passover at my next door neighbor's house.
How fitting to have Passover after you with the president of Egypt.
Well, exactly. And they were like, all my friends were like, what? That's crazy. How is that? I said, this is how crazy it is. Imagine a Jewish man standing before the leader of Egypt on the eve of Passover and saying, let my people come. That is not how the story goes. And yet, sure enough, that set into motion a relationship with President El-Sisi that I describe in Enemies and Allies, and that has opened up just a fascinating insight into the leadership of the world's largest Arab country and the world's largest Arab Christian community.
Joel, thank you so much for joining our conference. I wish you could have been here in person.
I would have liked that.
But
thank you for coming down to Washington.
I love coming down to Washington, D.C., and look at that view.
That's a good view.
I mean, it's a bit dusky now, but what a beautiful view. So thank you so much, Joel. God bless you and your family as you serve the Lord in Israel and around the globe.
Thank you, Mitch, and thank you for everybody who's watching as they continue to pray for peace, the peace of Jerusalem, and for all of our neighbors and all of our enemies.
Absolutely.
Thank you.